Okay, so we have still quite a bit of time, about 40 minutes or so. I'd be very happy to respond to any questions, queries, comments. We do have a roving mic, but it'll be too cumbersome to circulate it in the room. So please try and stand up and speak as clearly and as loudly as you can. Yes, at the back one.
I'm thinking about the distinction between tasks 2 and 3.
Mm-hmm.
I think if I can fiddle with your words and replace let go with let in,
Let in.
then
Mm-hmm.
it makes the difference between 2 and 3 much clearer. It makes the difference between 1 and 2 much worse.
Okay, well, again, I'm just giving fairly literal translations of the original terms. The word let go, I think, is pahana or something. And it's sometimes, in fact very often in Buddhism, translated as abandon, which I think is quite inappropriate, actually. It's too somehow rejecting. One of the problems Buddhism has is its rootedness in the Indian renunciant tradition, which is very much about leaving this world behind and somehow aspiring to some condition elsewhere after death. Let in, yes, if you like. I sometimes replace it with fall away. That one lets these impulses just fall away. Even let go implies a degree of volition that I feel is actually at odds with the quality of such experience. So, but I think all of us, if we find this helpful, we need to find a language that renders it meaningful to us, yes.
I actually think you're more of a Buddhist than I because when I listened to you, and at first I was kind of a bit ho-ha about it because you were attacking sort of making this religiosity and all this philosophical views that were incorrect and Asian and not appropriate. And then when I listened to you more deeply, your problem is more with the English language than it is with Buddhism.
Yeah, I agree.
Because the Four Noble Truths, which I hold the Four Noble Truths very dearly, and when you start to say, okay, it's not the noble truth, then it's not a truth, it's just, it's like, well, yeah, we get that. We all get that once we study it. Mm-hmm. The first noble truth has been the most profound thing in my life. Mm-hmm. Because to give up the idea of that I have to be happy all the time is a really good thing to let go of. And yes, Buddhists can be joyful. It's just that being attached to it is the problem. My question to you is about Buddhism for 2,500 years. I find it interesting that you want to revise it after that. So we've got 2,500 years where it has moved quite successfully to other countries. In Tibet, for example, it was over 100 years where they only translated and they did not give an individual unique commentary because they felt it had to be at least 100 years before they knew it enough in order to give a commentary. And maybe it's been 25 years and now you want to revise it to the next version. Buddhism in the West, its predominant issue is how does it, as a community-based religion, come into a self-centered, materialistic, individualistic society.
Thank you. I actually like your first comment, that I may be more Buddhist than I make out. I'm happy with that. And I agree with you. I think that when one applies thought and reflection onto, let's say, the Four Noble Truths, that yes, one does arrive at something not too far away from the sort of practice that I've described. And you're also, I think, quite correct in saying that I do have a struggle with the English language. But by that I would understand that part of the process whereby Buddhism comes into a new culture is by finding its own voice. And that, I feel, is inevitable, given the fact that even the most traditional Buddhist teacher will be asked questions that his tradition or her tradition does not actually have an answer for. Oh, I can think of many examples. Well, okay, for example, what is same-sex marriage, for example? Homosexuality.
One attachment or another attachment.
Well, maybe, but the point is that the tradition itself does not actually have a discourse around homosexuality. And that means that a Buddhist teacher has somehow got to find a way of responding to that concern of many people, and will find him or herself giving voice in a way that's specific to that occasion. And that may be a small example, but I think one that illustrates how, if you are practicing so-called right speech, you are already in the process of rethinking and expressing your tradition in a culture at a time that's looking for different kinds of answers to different sorts of questions. So if the tradition is a living tradition, then it's constantly in the process of somehow rethinking itself, rearticulating itself. And the great difference, which you also alluded to, between traditional Buddhist societies that have flourished in Asia for 2,500 years and our modern materialistic, individualistic modernity is a very considerable gulf. And for Buddhism to find a voice that speaks to the condition of modernity, I think is a far greater challenge than, for example, the challenge that Buddhism had to speak to the condition of 8th to 10th century Tibet. Where, again, it's true, you had a period where translation was preeminent, but actually the Pali texts, which are the ones that I'm primarily concerned with at the moment, were first translated in the late 19th century. We actually have more than 100 years. We have 2 or 3 versions now in English of the early Pali Canon. And so, even by your own standards, that period is now past. We are in a position, I think, of interpretation. I don't think we really have a choice, frankly. I think any practitioner who takes these values seriously will, both for themselves, in their own thinking, the internal coherence of their own ideas, as well as expressing and explaining what they do to, say, their families and their work, colleagues, friends, and so on, will necessarily involve interpretation. For better or for worse, I have found myself in this rather awkward position of being a voice amongst many that's seeking to find and arrive at a discourse that speaks more clearly to our condition. And in doing so, I've been influenced by Christianity, and I am concerned with some of the implications embedded in notions like truth. I feel there are deep problems there, and I feel a great liberation, in a way, to be able to find a discourse that does not require me to speak in that language. Yes?
Stephen, your view that we're entering an era of post-modernity, isn't that largely wishful thinking? Most cultures and religions still seem pretty committed to their absolute truths.
Well, of course, that's true, yes. I don't dispute that. And when I say we, I have to use that somewhat guardedly and advisedly, and acknowledge that we probably refers to relatively few people. It refers to a community largely of university-educated white people, males to a large degree. And so I acknowledge that, yes, I should be more specific in recognising that that is the discourse of a community of which I feel a part, yet, of course, in many regards, Buddhists, Western, modern, and Asian, are perfectly content and, in fact, find that the traditional language offers them the most effective discourse against the threat of modernity or post-modernity. So yes, I agree. But what can I do? I can't switch the clock back. I can't undo, as it were, my own history and my own role and journey through this material. Oh, yes, please. I'm sorry, I didn't see you. Yes.
I heard you speak in the past, and you had said some things that really spoke to my heart. One of them was that you don't go to the end of the path and you're done. And I would like you to talk a little bit about that, about the process that you have of cycling back through the four after you've done the path, so to speak.
Okay. Thank you for that. It's true that one of the problems with the metaphor of path is that we think of it as a linear process that starts in A and ends at Z. And that gives, I think, the notion that the Buddhist path or the Christian path or whatever has to do with some sort of linear process of progression or improvement. And then when we get to the end of the path, it's all done and we can pack up and go home. When I look at this in terms of these four tasks, though, I don't think of the path in terms of a linear progression, but actually what I prefer to call a positive feedback loop or a positive feed-forward loop. In other words, the embracing of dukkha, the letting go of grasping, the stopping, and then the acting leads us into another awareness through mindfulness, through concentration. And then we have to ask, well, what am I mindful of? What do I focus on? And that brings us back to the life situation we're in at this moment. It brings us back to the first task of embracing dukkha, which leads to the falling away, which leads to the stopping, which leads us at hopefully a deeper pitch or to deeper sense of refinement into the cultivating of our path. And I see this really as something that is ongoing and probably endless, or at least endless in terms of the length of our life here on earth. So I'm not interested really in achieving some final goal. If anything, and although this can be a bit of a cliche sometimes, the path itself is the goal. The cultivation of the path is actually what matters the most. And in doing so, I'm aware that at times I'll do that in ways that are better than at other times. At times I'll fail, at times I'll mess up, at times I'll get it wrong, and hopefully I'll learn from that. And that will then feed into this feedback loop that hopefully over time will become a deeper part of myself, will hopefully also benefit others with whom I'm related. So that's kind of how I see it. It's an ongoing feedback loop that will continue as long as I find myself here on this earth.
Yes. One view of the direction your thought has taken, which seems to me to be from doctrine to practice, is that you've wound up back with the big questions of the classical Greeks. What is a good life? How should we live our lives? If you think that is right, and you take a modern view of this, then one approach to this is essentially an experiential or empirical one. One tries one thing and is mindful, one looks at how one responds to it, or what effects it has, one tries something else, and so on. If one does this, then what is it in your view that becomes the criterion? How does one know? Is it purely something subjective as to whether this is working or not? Is it something external? what is the epistemology of this, if you want to take that framework?
Okay. Well, I do feel that this approach does reflect or go back to particularly the Hellenistic philosophers. I'm very interested, and have been for some years now, in the rather striking parallels, particularly between early Buddhism as we find it in the Pali Canon, and, say, the teachings and the practices of the Epicureans and the Stoics. Epicurus in particular, I think, is on a very similar wavelength to what's going on here. I think that in many ways, because Buddhism has been thought of as a religion, it tends to then be compared to the religion of Christianity. And there's a great deal of dialogue and interfaith meetings and Zen meditation in Catholic monasteries and so on and so on. But we rather forget that these teachings might actually have also very strong resonances with another source of our own culture, and that is that of the Greek philosophers, for whom philosophy was not an academic discipline, but it was a way of life. Philosophy was about, as I think even Aristotle talks of it, as the healing of the soul. And this is a practice. There are spiritual exercises that these communities performed in order to realize these goals. They're likewise, particularly Epicureanism, they're non-theistic. There's no notion of God. And in this regard, I feel that we can articulate a Buddhist practice in terms of the attainment of ataraxia in Greek, untroubledness, which is a goal of Pyrrho, a goal of Epicurus. It's very similar to the idea of nibbana. The stopping of craving is ataraxia. It's an untroubled state of mind. And that leads to what the Greeks call eudaimonia, which is the good life, if you wish, which nowadays is sometimes translated as human flourishing. And I think the practice of the Eightfold Path, the practice of Elsa, is really the practice of human flourishing. In fact, the Buddha uses a metaphor that's very close to that. He says that the wise person should train himself just as a farmer irrigates a field. In other words, allows in a barren land the possibility, through watering and caring for a field, the literal flourishing of plants or trees or whatever. But coming to your actual question, which is a difficult one, my own sense is
well, I'll just make a comment that a sort of formula that was quite widely embraced amongst the Hellenes was what is the purpose of philosophy if it does not help us live?
Yes, exactly.
And this goes exactly.
That's exactly. If that is an adequate answer, then that's the one I would choose. I think this is of no value if it doesn't actually allow us to flourish in all areas of our lives. If Buddhism is just a practice that gives you a certain degree of inner peace, that's a good thing. But I don't feel it's really tapped into the potential of this practice as something that engages with our entire humanity. So that would be one criterion. But I think I think we learn to judge that in terms basically of trial and error. I think it's by doing these things, by taking risks. I think there's an element of an ethic of risk involved here. We cannot know the outcomes of our choices and acts. But on the other hand, to not act, in a sense, is also to disengage to a point of indifference and lifelessness. So we are somehow bound to act. And as we do so, we experience and we note and we try to understand the consequences of what we say and do. And it's through learning and paying attention to those consequences that over time we begin to cultivate maybe a more appropriate, a more refined intuition as to what is the right thing to do. Knowing that we'll never know for certain, but perhaps we can gain, through experience, a better kind of set of antennae to make those choices.
So you're saying it's essentially a subjective process, though?
No, not
to
at all.
judge whether this outcome is a good one or a bad one?
Well, no, not just subjective. It also has a lot to do with the actual effects that others feed back to us, and the impact of our lives on others, the impact of our lives on our world, on our society, our community, our environment. All of those have to be taken into consideration. It's certainly not just about what feels right to me. That's one element. I think it's probably an important element. But it cannot be done in isolation, otherwise we end up with a sort of solipsism.